delighted to introduce David Anderson. He's at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and he's leading the Paleoclimatology branch, which also includes the database that we all know, or we should all know. And I'm particularly happy that we at Pages that we work increasingly closely together with NOAA to really boost the data sharing. And we're going to hear more about that, about the data sharing from David. Now, David.
Before I begin, since Torsten mentioned the World Data Center for Paleoclimatology, first I want to point out that 1/2 of the archive is contributed by people outside the United States. So it's a really rich, diverse archive, and it really rests on the generosity of people who contribute their data. And second, I want to put in a shameless plug. As soon as your data is published, please submit it to the World Data Center for Paleoclimatology. And then finally, use the data. It's a tremendous resource. The title of my talk is Data Intensive Science, What It Means for You. And you're such a diverse audience in terms of background, and that this is actually a fairly challenging talk. So what I've tried to do is assemble a talk based around 3 themes. First, I'm going to talk about data-intensive science. I'm going to define what I mean by data-intensive science. And I'm going to tell you 2 stories about where data-intensive science has led to some pretty heavily cited publications. Second, in the middle part of my talk, I'm going to talk about some hints on how to find data so that you can do data-intensive science. I'm going to talk about software tools, paleoclimate data, and how to find climate data. And then in the third part of my talk, and the one where we will probably have the most discussion, I'm going to talk about data sharing. I'm going to give you some insights into what I think people are doing for data sharing, and I'm going to talk about some ways that we can improve. So with this outline, I'm actually going to break for comments and questions from you at the end of each part. So we'll talk a little bit about data-intensive science and then stop for questions. Then we'll talk a little bit about hints for data and then stop for questions. And then finally, we'll end with a discussion on data sharing. First of all, a definition of data-intensive science. This is a new enough term and it's a fast-moving, evolving enough field that the definitions are actually changing and are hard to come by. Here's one good definition though. Data-intensive science is reusing scientific data to solve problems and test hypotheses. And so in that mode, we can distinguish this from field work, going out in the field and collecting data, and from laboratory analysis, where we step into the laboratory and analyze data. This is really using existing data and reusing data to solve problems and test hypotheses. I'm going to read you another long definition of data-intensive science because I think it's worthwhile. This is from Jim Gray, a leader in cyber infrastructure. Everything about science is changing because of the impact of information technology. Experimental, theoretical, and computational science are all being affected by the data deluge. And a fourth, data-intensive science paradigm is emerging. The goal is to have a world in which all of the science literature is online. All of the science data is online, and they interoperate with each other. Lots of new tools are needed to make this happen. Pretty good definition. Wouldn't that be a pretty good world if we were there already? Okay, I also want to talk about one other aspect of data-intensive science. So in the US, EarthCube is a massive new initiative, millions of dollars being poured into this idea of creating and improving the cyber infrastructure that enables data-intensive science. So just last week, I was at a February workshop on paleo geosciences. We sat down in a breakout session, and in about 45 minutes, we identified 160 different resources that are available to you right now, ranging from software tools to databases to other types of resources. 160 different things that you could tap into right now. Pretty impressive. So, open source software was in the other categories there. So, this is being built for you. It's not the older guard that's going to take advantage of this. It's really the young, computer savvy scientist that's going to be able to tap these resources. Okay, so now I want to describe to you two stories that kind of typify data-intensive science, and the first is Ledecky and Ramos' production of this stack. So the hypothesis here is that there's a common signal in the deep ocean isotope of carbonate records that's driven by ice volume and deep ocean temperature during the Quaternary. There's a couple of ways to test or resolve this hypothesis. One is, imagine without any records available trying to create this. Go to sea, how many cruises, analyzing 20, say you need 24 different deep sea benthic isotope records, sample resolution of a third of a sample per 1,000 years, times 5 million years, 40,000 measurements. How long would that take? So you could approach this problem with a theoretical study. Well, that's not very satisfying. But this new data-intensive way is to collect all the published records from Pangea, from NOAA, from other repositories, perhaps a couple of your own studies, but not 40,000 measurements. So there's a data-intensive way of reusing data in order to test this hypothesis. I think this was shown earlier. So what we're looking at here, over 5 million years, are a series of benthic ocean isotope records. When I look at that, I'm absolutely amazed. I mean, just at the volume of work and what you can do with this type of compilation. And then where it also was particularly useful was looking farther back in time and identifying these ocean isotope stages and this variability. And so on the next slide here, we're looking at the older interval from 5 million to 3.5 million years ago. And you can see here the labeled isotope stages. And this incredible amount of information that's been brought together that many of you have already cited in some of your papers. Make no mistake, this is going to be one of the most often cited papers in paleoceanography. So there's a pretty big bang for the buck in doing some of this data-intensive science in terms of the number of citations that you'll receive. The next example or story I want to tell you about data-intensive science is an effort that's currently underway, the PAGES 2K effort to create regional reconstructions of temperature and eventually precipitation and perhaps sea level pressure over just the last 2,000 years by compiling existing data. So many of you are aware of what's going on with here, or some of you in the room are actually part of this, but this is another project. And again, you know, we're not fishing for results here. We're really starting with a hypothesis and using this data-intensive model to test that hypothesis, analogous to the same way we go into the lab or into the field to test that hypothesis. So it's not fishing, it's trying to get the data you need that are sufficient to answer a research question. And here, the research question of the PAGES 2K synthesis is that the time series of temperature during the last 2 millennia varies regionally. For example, you might propose that the Arctic temperature variations are twice as large, and showing that the Arctic region is particularly sensitive. So again, you know, one approach. And here it's not just going to sea, but you've actually got to go to ice, you've got to go to lakes, you've got to go to trees, you've got to go spelunking. If you think of this dollar cost of going out to collect these records, what are we, 100 million? I don't know how much it would cost. So instead, or you could approach this as a theoretical problem, again, running a climate model with transient forcing, or you could step into the laboratory. But here's this other data-intensive approach where you can collaborate with colleagues to collect published records from Pangea, from NOAA, and other repositories, and create a synthesis. So I'm not going to show any results from the PAGES 2K synthesis, but I just want to illuminate the problem and the way data can contribute here a little bit more. So prior to this effort to create regional reconstructions, this was the state of the art. This is the global average reconstructed temperature, but this is often referred to as the spaghetti diagram. So we're looking from the present back over the last 1,000 years at the temperature variations. These are all supposed to be indicating the same thing. There shouldn't be differences. This shouldn't be spaghetti, but instead it is. So PAGES can address this. Are some of these actually regionally distinct or regionally biased records? One of the questions I'm really interested in is, there you can see some decadal variability here. Are those, does each region vary on the decadal scale differently from another region? All these questions can be addressed by bringing together a synthesis of data in a way that would be really hard to address if you went out and did new field and new analysis to produce this data. The last thing I want to show you on the pages effort is the geographic scope. So this here, that didn't come out very well, but this here shows, I think at least in some of the colors here, you can see the data density here for North America. Here's some Antarctica, still pretty sparse. That's an area where we actually need to go into the field and collect more data. You can see here in the Arctic circle here that the data distribution is going to be pretty exciting. So that concludes the first part of my talk, and I just want to ask and take questions at that point. Do people have a good sense of what I mean by data-intensive science? Do you think that it has the potential to match what you can do in the lab? I have one microphone here.
Well, I have done sort of like data-intensive science, and I've used a lot of paleoclimate reconstruction, and it was very hard for me to obtain complete data sets. And I actually found that sometimes the amount of effort that goes into compiling such a data set to test such a hypothesis is not really recognized. So it was really difficult to obtain the complete data set. And of course, yes, you can get a nice result, but it was also sort of like half a year only to assemble the data.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And again, you know, my job up here is to motivate you to pick up data-intensive science as one of the components of what you do. So I'm going to give you a hard sell that this is going to lead to citations, it's going to lead to some great hypothesis testing and stuff. But you're right. So where we are right now, we're far from that vision that I presented in the second slide. Where we are right now is that it takes a good 6 months to go find all this data, and everything's in different formats. You got to manipulate it, you got to change it. 3 comments. One is it's worth it. Second is, hey, send it back to the data center. You know, once you've done it and then once you've published it, that helps your colleagues. So that's going to accelerate the pace of paleoscience. And then the third comment I'd make is that I do firmly believe that we are going to get there, where there's this seamless interoperability between publications and data that's going to make for a really fast-paced, exciting time of progress in paleo geosciences. Yeah.
The only thing that I would really kind of stress, I really like this, but I would really like to ask you to share your data as well.
We'll talk about sharing as the third topic. So, yeah.
The motivation.
Yeah. 2 more questions there.
Yeah, my comment or question is if you want to work with like comparing data, is it possible, or would you think that you would in some way like have a software, have a program that makes it easy for the user, you know, to compile data or to compare data, or is it something you plan to have online or something? Because you know, if you're not say the computer person and just work with Excel is forever.
That question has so many facets, I'm not sure I can even understand it. I'm going to attempt to when I talk about sources of data and software a little later. So, yeah.
I have a question about statistics.
Yeah.
When you do these giant data synthesis and then you line things up and it's basically just either we then go from these big data synthesis to something where we can say these wiggles do match up within a confidence.
Yeah, there's 2 parts to that question. One is because we're looking at things that are changing through time, can we go into these archives when we're doing this and align the data better or do things to the data that make it more powerful? And the second question is, where do we get a hold of the statistical tools to analyze these data efficiently and in a successful way? On the first question, and again in this effort to motivate and inspire you, every published paleo record's age scale could be improved. There is no doubt in my mind. And I'm actually coming after some giants in the field who have really said, look, let's expect to revise all these age models. one of the things I really feel bad about is that we haven't done a better job at making the age model revisions better. So that you could go in to a set of data, you collect 150 records, and all of the age models you could change to use the latest C14 calibration. You could change to test some correlations. We're not there yet, but we're going to get there. And that same comment is most important regarding age, but that same comment applies to calibrations. Our transfer functions change, our scaling of oxygen isotopes change. So both for improving age models and for improving calibrations, one of the fundamental reasons to have a data archive is that you go in and get the raw data and redo the calibrations. The second part of your question, where do I get the statistics? I'm going to talk about tools in a minute, so we'll go into that in a little more detail. Okay.
Yeah, just follow up your point about you used age models as the example, but distinguishing between raw data and derived or inferred data. Age models are inferred, and often that's confused in the databases. And, workers that aren't intimately familiar with the data sometimes get this confused in synthesis products. But I wanted to go another direction too, because as we move toward these big data approaches, we all know that there's good data and bad data. And there's very little basis for putting quality control into the databases. It's subjective sometimes, and of course, we all think our data are great, but we all know that sometimes our data aren't great. How to deal with that in this approach toward data mining?
Right. It's a little bit of a cop-out, but for my team, we built this database mostly on published data, and so we've been able to fall back a little bit and rely on peer review as one level of initial scrutiny of data. And I think as we move into a world where there are data publications, so you could actually create a publication that just has a data set, a description, some explanatory notes, some references, and that's a data publication. So as we move into that, I think there will also be some peer review applied to that. The second part of that question, though, is that every number needs to really be picked up and looked at. And over time, we can apply some statistical approaches or quality control measures that are ubiquitous throughout the sciences. And one limitation of the NOAA Paleoclimatology Archive is that the data come to us and have come to us since 1991 in different formats, except for the tree ring database, which is cleanly formatted. But they've come to us in different formats, and we didn't recognize this. It wasn't a goal in 1991. So it's very hard to pick up each data set and do some rudimentary quality control because each one is in a different format. We are now aggressively and energetically trying to move into a framework where we can pick up each piece of data and do that, but we're not there yet. Is that part of the answer? Yeah. The client, enough said. Okay, in the middle part of my talk here, I'm going to talk first a little bit about where to get paleo data, then a little bit about where to get instrumental climate data. Hadley Center, from the National Climatic Data Center, from the Earth System Research Laboratory, Earth System Grid. IRI maintains a climate data library. Many of you use the KNMI Data Explorer. That's a lot of fun. And then I think many of you know that the IPCC has its own data distribution center, not just for climate data, but also for many different types of climate-related economic data. And unfortunately, if you wade into the climate data, so now we're talking about climate, not paleoclimate, but if you wade into the climate data, you got to kind of unfortunately get to know this acronym soup. But a couple of data sets to know: COAD's the Comprehensive Ocean Atmospheres Data Set, the WCMWF and NCEP reanalysis products. So these are gridded meteorological variables created by model output that's informed by data. Available and run since the 1950 up to the present. The Global Historical Climate Network, GPCP, the Global Precipitation Climatology centers data sets at different resolutions. And then these global average time series from HAD Crew. NOAA calls theirs this goofy name, the Merged Land Ocean Surface Temperature Data Set. And then just last week, the Surface Ocean Carbon Atlas. So again, grab my talk if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about these, Google these, but I just want to give you the sense that there's a huge amount of data out there. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of resources is this world of open source software. And so these are sources of some of these tools that we were asking about earlier that can be used to quality control data or do statistics on data. So I just want to give you, many of you have used Analysis Series, this package which does a whole bunch of things related to the time series analysis and age modeling of climate data. Bacon I haven't used yet, but the Bayesian method for calibrating C14. Corewall is a way of visualizing data sets. So all of this is shareware, freely available. NASA's made their an early version of their general circulation model available and an educational climate model. So there's just a really rich set of software tools that you can use in conjunction with your own research. Okay, I think since I'm running out of time, I won't take questions on that, but if there are more questions about where to get data, where to get software, we'll talk about it at the end. But now I just want to go into the last part of this talk, and I want to make a couple comments about contributing your data and contributing your code. And then I think my last two slides are on data sharing, and we can talk a little bit and ask questions about sharing data. The goal of this part of the talk is to convince you that it's really easy to share your data. Right now, at NOAA, we just say, check the guidelines to make sure your data is complete and in a usable format. Contact us if you have questions about what to include. You can also search our existing entries for example data sets. But then we're saying just email us the data. It doesn't get a lot easier than that. Pangea has a slightly more elaborate process. Their instructions, when you start the data submission process below, you will be redirected to the Pangea issue tracker that will assist you in providing metadata and uploading data files. Any communication with our editors will go through this issue tracker. That's kind of like a help desk kind of situation. But again, it's really pretty easy. As we move into this data-intensive kind of era, it's going to get harder to submit your data because the requirements imposed upon you for creating a complete data submission and doing some initial quality control are going to increase. But right now, it's pretty easy. And when I talk about submitting data to the World Data Center, I'm really talking about your published research. I'm really not looking, I don't think we're really looking for unpublished results at this time. That may change in the future, but right now it's like publish it first, then submit it to us. And then there are also repositories such as SourceForge for open source code. So SourceForge acts as a centralized location for software developers to control and manage free and open software development. One other thing I didn't mention before is that one of the other advantages of picking up some of this open software is that this is one way that you can use tools and statistical methods that have already been sanctioned by the community and tested over time. For example, there's in the paleoceanography community that I come from, there's probably no more tried and tested method than the IMRI-KIP transfer function method. Well, that's in SourceForge. You can pick up the IMRI-KIP code and bring it into your R computing environment or your MATLAB environment and run this computer program that's been run thousands of times over the last 30 years. So another powerful advantage of using open source is that you're using stuff that our community is familiar with and has vetted. Okay, so a couple comments from me about data sharing, and the question for you, how do you think we're doing? In the US, we kind of have this phrase, if it's been produced with taxpayer money, the data must be archived. The two big gray areas here are, how long do you get to hang on to your data before you archive it? And where it gets slippery and gray is, if you're writing another proposal and it's a continuation. You get to hang on to the data. And then second is, a proposal is only 2 or 3 years long. A PhD student tenure is probably 5 years. If the proposal's over, but the students are still working on it, should people be able to hang on to it? I'm glad I'm not in the stick business of data requirements. I'm much happier being in the carrot end of things where we get to encourage people but don't have to apply this pressure. But I think as this data-intensive science gets more popular, people will start to add increasing pressure on archiving the data. The last sticky place in putting pressure on people to archive their data is, do I have to archive it all or just what appeared in the paper? And that's a really gray area that people haven't resolved yet. Yeah.
This is a bit more of a comment related to this. So in one of the communities that I work in, kind of the Tetra community where we do correlations, accessing data has always been a huge, huge problem because of the particularities of the data we actually work with. And our community internally, when we had our latest meeting, and there were papers that came out of that with suggestions that said, essentially from this point on, if you publish a paper that has any type of data, then please take that data, your standard data and everything, and make it a supplementary to your paper. And that has, a lot of people are doing that now, and it's just completely changing the face of how you can work. And it's easy because journals have the ability now to actually carry quite a bit of supplemental data online. So it's working within the community and encouraging your members as well. For us to make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think we should probably end there. But it relates to supplementary information and also relates to your efforts to get credit for your work. So if you've been following my talk at all, you can see that it's possible now to bring 100 different published studies, so all this data to bear on a particular problem and create a new study. What do you do? How do you give those 100 people's previous work sufficient credit? And this is a problem. And I think we're in a fluid state here where it's evolving. But right now, I am, in my opinion, would like to encourage you to use supplemental information to acknowledge those people by providing a piece of supplemental information, which is a supplemental bibliography. And my guess is that the journals will respond to this and actually begin to take that supplementary information and track it and get it into the citation world so that people get credit. Are you going to correct me?
I was just saying, no, a lot of supplementary information doesn't make it onto ISI. If you request it as an author, they will separately upload it, but as a journal, we haven't really gotten there, and I think that's across the board. And another quick thing about SI, a lot of that is not behind a firewall, so you have to be a subscriber. I know ours isn't, anyone can get SI, but I know a lot of journals, it's behind a firewall, so do be careful about that, because you may be limiting access to people who don't have a subscription to that journal.
This is probably one of the hottest areas in data-intensive science right now, is how to provide credit for these compilations when you assemble a whole bunch of different data granules. Yeah, there's one last question in the back.
Yeah, just a quick comment about climate model output, because that's obviously another source of data in geosciences, but the volume of data obviously clearly is much greater. So I guess my question is, can I email you 30 terabytes of output? And if not, what do I do?
Yes, bring it on. We'll find a way. No, I'm really serious. Yeah, no, because our community, there's so much satellite data hitting receivers on the planet every day that's the big gorilla in the room, and they're finding ways to deal with satellite data. And even the model stuff, although you guys are pretty energetic, even the model stuff is small compared to the incredible amount of satellite data so far. So bring it on. Repositories will find a way.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for discussing.